Hi, I'm talking to you today from the Grand Hall of the Museum of Timekeeping, which is where we house our collection of long case clocks. I'm going to be talking to you about these three clocks here, which represent the early days of long case clocks. The first is this clock here, which is a replica made by Peter Hayward and is a replica of a monk's prayer clock. To wind it, all I need to do is pull on this counterweight, like this, and now we can see that the foliate bar begins to oscillate. It's that regulates the speed at which this weight drops and passes energy from A to B within the escapement itself. You'll notice that there are no hands on this dial at all, and that's because this clock wasn't really designed to tell accurate time, rather to denote the passing of hours so that the monks knew when to pray. You can see here there's a peg inserted into the dial, and when that peg reaches this bar here, it triggers a chain reaction which sounds the alarm, and that is what we call the monks to prayer. So this type of escapement, which is a virgin foliate escapement, is one of the very earliest clock escapements in the way that we would recognise a clock. They became popular on the mainland Europe in around the 13th century, and sort of made it over here to the UK about 100 years later. So this really represents the very earliest of domestic use clocks. Coming across to this clock, not a replica but rather an original, this is the oldest working clock within our collection at the Museum of Timekeeping. Dating from 1655, this was made by Andrew Allam of London and is a lantern clock. This was the most popular kind of domestic clock from the 17th century all the way through until the mid-19th century, so really successful. There are a couple of reasons that we think that these clocks might be called lantern clocks. The first is because of the way that they are presented in the home, so up high like this. This one is set on a bracket, but originally it would have been hung like a lantern from the wall. And also the Old English word for brass is latten, and all of these clocks were made out of brass. So it could well be a bit of a combination of the two, that they looked like lanterns and they were made of latten. So this clock, we can see, has a pendulum. And for those of you who are familiar with the history of pendulums, you will have already jumped on the fact that this clock actually predates the invention of the pendulum by about 20 years. So this pendulum is a modern retrofit. By modern, I do mean sort of around 1700, but in terms of the clock, it's fairly modern. And there's a very good reason for that. This clock just missed out on being made in an era where most clocks were made with pendulums, and pendulums revolutionised time-telling across the globe. Now, I'm going to wind this clock, and we can see that it is a simple weight-driven 30-hour device, only we'll come back to the 30-hour bit later. Now, I need to grab a hold of this ring here and pull gently, as with the other hand, I lift the weight like this. Once I get to about here, I can then just pull on this rope and pull the weight right up into the housing there at the top. To then set the clock going, I very simply just need to push the pendulum and off it goes. I'm not going to set the time right for this video because it will be a whole lot of chiming and I won't get a word in edgeways. But you can see here on the dial, there's only one hand. And the reason that there's only one hand on this clock is because when it was made in 1655, when it would have used a virgin foliate escapement, much like the clock we looked at before, this clock would have been, frankly, a terrible timekeeper. Before the advent of the pendulum, you could expect a clock like this to lose anywhere between 15 and 45 minutes a day. Completely inaccurate. Further to this, the way that the clock was set was inaccurate in itself. So in the 1650s, domestic clocks would have been given their time by the local church clock. The local church clock, in turn, would have been set by the sundial normally found on the side of the church or in the grounds of the church. Well, we're set in England, and for those familiar with England as a country, they'll know that it's probably only sunny about 40% of the time on a good year. This means that the church clock was probably being guessed at a little bit, because if the person in charge of the church clock went out to look at the sundial to find the correct time to set the church clock by and found it was cloudy, they wouldn't have an accurate solar time to set their clock to. So then you've got an inaccurate church clock advising an equally inaccurate lantern clock, coupled with the fact that while I said that this should be a 30-hour movement, the length of the rope here will run out in about 10 hours, which means every 24-hour period you have to wind your clock 3 times to keep it running. The chances of people remembering to do that day after day after day and never ever slipping up and forgetting to wind the clock are fairly slim. So really, it had a lot working against it. But then there came the pendulum. And once the pendulum was introduced and retrofitted to this clock, it would suddenly go to probably losing somewhere in the region of 3 seconds a week when kept wound. It was that difference between, 45 minutes a day lost to 3 seconds a week. Phenomenal change in technology, and one that, of course, is still used regularly in modern clocks as well. So as we've said, this only has the hour hand because that really was as accurate as you could get it. 20 years after this clock was made, famous clockmaker Joseph Knibb of London made this clock. So in just 2 decades, we go from a clock that looks quite alien to us in terms of what we see as a domestic clock to this. This has currently got its hood off because I'm going to wind it for you. And how we do that is to firstly open up these peepholes on the dial by pulling this cord here. So when I pull on that, it exposes the winding brackets and the winding holes. And I can then take my clock key. This one takes a size 16. And making sure that the pendulum isn't running, I can wind the clock. And to do so, this is winding the weight up, which is for the strike. It may just need to catch up with itself. And it's important to never wind your clock whilst it's in motion. So whilst it's chiming, whilst it's playing music, if it's a musical clock, it must be left to finish. Now that that's finished, I'm going to wind this. And this mechanism deals with the clock itself, so the timekeeping mechanism within the escapement. Here we go, and I'm going to wind that up halfway as well. And then, much like the Alam of London clock, to get this clock going, I just need to start the pendulum. So again, very gently, side to side, and there we go. So the clock is now started. Again, I'm not going to set the time right now because that's quite time-consuming in itself. But I'm going to shut the case and pop the hood back on and then talk to you about the clock. Here we go. Now that I've got the hood back on, I'm going to talk to you a bit about this clock. We can see that whereas the Alam, the lantern clock, only has the one hand on its dial, in just 20 years we now have not only the hour hand, but the minutes hand, and as well a seconds hand. And that really goes to show just how much of an improvement to precision timekeeping it was to add a pendulum onto the escapement. We also see that we now have a full wooden case, whereas the Alam has its weights and pendulums free. Now, I think, and this is only my thoughts, that very quickly people would have realised that if you have a pendulum, it must be encased. When a weight was purely weight-driven, if I were to knock into the weights of this clock, like so, it won't affect the running of the clock, so long as you're not really pulling on it or anything. However, if I were to knock into the pendulum, the clock would stop and also possibly be damaged as well. If you've got children, or dogs for that matter, you know that trying to keep things and people away from the pendulum would be almost impossible, so really casing these became a necessity. From the end of the 17th century, it became fairly standard for cabinet makers and carpenters to be making clock cases like this one out of walnut. Walnut was the choice wood, and it was brought over largely from the mainland Europe. However, by the end of the 18th century, there became a real problem with bringing it across, and that was largely down to a few environmental factors that decimated the walnut stock. There were a series of very cold, wet winters followed by hot, dry summers, which decimated all of the seasoned wood. And on top of that, the wet wood stock was damaged as well by a disease quite similar to Dutch elm disease, completely decimating the forests being grown for woodstock. So this is really classic of its time within England. We can see it's got the barleycorn twists either side of the dial here, very fashionable right into the 1800s. And then we can see with this sort of pelmet device up here with the wood carvings, again, very typical of its time. And this would have been a fine domestic clock, really fashionable right up until the middle of the 1800s. To sum up, these three clocks are a perfect demonstration of just how quickly technology advanced within horology once the pendulum came along. To just recap quickly, we have here the monk's clock using a very simple foliate and verge escapement. This kind of escapement used for hundreds of years, not particularly accurate, but still able to denote hours passing. And then we have lantern clocks, which were first really seen in about 1580. Very popular domestic clocks, the first true affordable domestic clock available on the market. But within just a few years of the pendulum coming in, we make a huge leap from these wall-mounted clocks to the traditional long case clock behind me here.